right, so in this video, we're going to talk about compression. Now, compression is probably one of my favorite tools to use because you can add both character to things, but you can also use it as very much a utility to help control things. So let's talk about what compression is. Compression is the ability to compress the dynamic range of a signal. So when you have, say, something like a vocalist who sings very low and quiet when they're singing a verse, but then gets to a very loud volume when they're singing a chorus, if you want to be able to have the volumes of those be the same, you could have your finger on the fader and bring it up for the verse and bring it down for the chorus. Or we could use an automated tool that actually does that for us, which is what compression can be used for. Compression basically limits the amount of dynamic range, or how much of a difference there is between the quietest point and the loudest point, and brings them together. And the way it does that is actually by reducing the peaks of information, or the biggest and loudest points, and brings them down more in line and closer to those low points. So by doing that, we actually will bring things down together, so that way we hear things at almost a similar volume, but we still perceive the loudness difference somewhat, and we perceive the intensity difference between them, even though the volume of things is still roughly the same, or it's more closer to each other. So let's actually take a listen to what the compressor can do, and then we'll talk about all the different parts of the compressor and how to work with them. So I've got an acoustic guitar here. Let's take a listen. Already a great starting point. This is a great sounding acoustic. We don't have to do a whole lot to it. But I do want to bring the dynamics in a little bit, because I find that some of the strums are louder than others, to the point where I would rather it be kind of more this consistent sound. I want the intensity of feeling to be there, but I don't want the volume peaks to be there. So let's bring a compressor into this. Now, before we actually start adding the compressor to this, let's talk about all the different parts of the compressor so we can understand what we're actually doing. So let's first start with this first one called threshold. Threshold is similar to the threshold on a gate, in that we're telling it at what point do we want to start doing this processing that we're applying here. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, at this level, we want to start compressing the signal. We want to start bringing it down. By how much, though, is controlled by the next feature, which is the ratio. So ratio is where things kind of a little confusing, because people look at this number and go, okay, well, why is it 3-to-1 or 5-to-1 or 10-to-1? If we look at the graph here, actually, we can see that when we have a 2-to-1, we're not cutting our dB off by much, because you can see when it hits that almost negative 20 dB mark, we're cutting the signal kind of in half. It's not as steep of a curve. But if we start increasing the ratio, well, anytime we start going above that threshold, we're cutting our signal immensely. It's almost like it's not even going to get any louder. And to the point where if we were to set this all the way up to infinity, or even just 40-to-1, which is just right before infinity on this case, in this compressor, you can see that anything above minus 20 dB is basically going to be leveled off. It's not allowed to get any louder than that. And that's kind of the idea behind ratio here, is that what we're doing is we're saying how much over the limit are we allowing you to go, and it's controlling how many dB it's cutting it by. So a low ratio is going to be doing minimal compression. Usually 2-to-1, 3-to-1 is considered a low compression ratio. And those ones are really kind of designed to just kind of touch the dynamics of things and just kind of pat it down. Sometimes it's used just to add a little bit of character to it, but not much. Versus a 4-to-1 or a 10-to-1, those are super, super aggressive ratios, and so we're going to hear it more, we're going to feel it more, and we're going to be cutting a lot of gain out of our signal. So the next controls to talk about are going to be attack and release. Now, similar to gate, these are timing elements in that we're choosing how quickly or how slowly we want to react to changes that happen in the signal. So attack is going to be how quickly do we want to grab the signal after it's hit our threshold. A super fast attack is going to immediately grab that signal and start pulling it down by the ratio we've set. Versus a slow attack is going to give it a little bit of time to react. So we'll hear the initial transient of that signal hit, then we'll pull things down. So you can use that actually to add some characteristics to your sound, because you want to maybe have the initial hit of your snare or the initial strum of your guitar come through, and then it starts to level things down. Or if you turn the attack all the way up, you'll actually end up killing those transients, and you'll actually be able to level things off. So the initial hit of the acoustic strings or the initial hit of the snare become the same level as the rest of the sound of the guitar as it rings out. Now with release, on the other hand, release is controlling how quickly or how slowly we release the compression after it's gone below the threshold. So a quick release is going to kind of create this pumping effect where we're going to hear it letting go as soon as it goes below the threshold. But if we slow it down, it becomes this more gradual, almost more natural and musical feeling towards it. So attack and release values are very important when it comes to compression because they really affect the characteristics of the sound. So we'll be messing with those to really listen to and hear what we're doing to our sound and choosing what we want the sound to sound like through those two values. So there's another element we need to talk about here, which is going to be the knee of the compressor. Now, the knee of a compressor basically is, it's kind of a way of almost choosing, do we want this compressor to only react to the threshold that we've set, so it has to hit that point exactly and then it starts working? Or do we want it to start working before it hits that point and kind of gradually get to the compression settings we set? Let me show you on the board here what that looks like. So as you can see here on the board, we've got what's considered a hard knee here. And that's because if you look at that little angle there, it almost looks like someone's leg is kind of bent, like they're sitting down and letting their leg kind of hang out a little bit. And there's that little point there right at about minus 20 dB where we can see it bend, and that's considered the knee. Now, if we were to engage the soft knee here, you can see actually our point where that actually begins went down. It's also not nearly as steep of a curve, but it's a longer, more gradual curve. And you'll see here that that kind of bend point almost starts at about negative 37, 35 dB, even though our threshold's set at negative 18 to negative 20 dB. So why is it looking like this? Well, what's happening is that instead of it compressing only when we hit our threshold, it starts to compress ever so little at the further end, closer towards where that knee begins to curve. And then as we get closer to our threshold point, we start to compress more and more and more. So why would we do this? Well, the reason is because we may want to have something that's not as noticeable. We want to have a compression that is a little bit more tame, a little bit more gradual, and a little more musical in that it's not just grabbing all the big hits, but it kind of grabs a little bit of everything, but it's not doing it at the full power of the compressor. So we can use a soft knee like this to kind of introduce compression to a signal that we don't want it to be super aggressive with, especially at lower volumes of its signal. When it hits bigger points, though, it'll be the full compression setting. It'll be the full gain reduction. But what we're hearing at the lower values is something a little bit more tame and more subtle. Now, at the bottom there, right below threshold, is this gain. And gain is basically adding signal back after we've compressed it, because you see what happens is that when we compress a signal, we will start cutting out a lot of the volume of it. So we want to bring that back up to the level we had when the signal came in, because remember, we're trying to bring the dynamics together. So if we start cutting things down from the top end, then we're not going to have that same volume. So instead, what we're trying to do is this: we're trying to bring the big peaks of volume down and then overall bring everything up so they're at that level we want. Let's take a listen here to this compressor in action on this acoustic guitar, and we'll listen to it before without any compression on, and then we'll actually engage the compressor and hear what the difference is. Okay, so right off the bat, the first thing you probably noticed that it got quieter, and that's because we're cutting our signal pretty heavily, almost 10 dB, which is a very large amount of gain reduction for a compressor to be doing. That's a pretty aggressive one, which I actually wouldn't be doing this much compression, but I wanted you to be able to hear what is actually happening. Now, let's take a listen to what happens when we adjust things like the threshold, the ratio, and then we'll also adjust the knee, and then we'll go from there and talk a little bit more about what is actually happening. So let's drop the threshold down. Cutting almost double now the signal at 20 dB. Let's bring it back up. 4 to 1. Let's go to 2 to 1. Let's crank it up now. Let's go to 10 to 1. Now you can probably start hearing that pumping effect happening here, where those big hits are really getting cut down by that 10 to 1 setting. Versus if we go back to the 2 to 1, it's cutting it, but it's not significant. It's not as much of a gain reduction as it was with the 10 to 1. All right, now let's listen to it with the soft neon. Ratio to 4 to 1 here. And let's turn the soft knee off. Back on. All right, so let's talk about what we just heard. So first off, when we dropped the threshold down, everything got immensely quieter. It's basically because we just brought all the limits of how loud things can get way down. So we were basically, it's almost like bringing the volume of your fader down in a sense, but instead it's doing it by cutting how much signal we told it to cut by, which is controlled by the ratio. Now, when we brought the threshold up, it basically gave us that headroom back again where things could get loud again, but we still had the same kind of low end volume as we did before when we had the threshold all the way down. Now, when we touched the ratio and we had a really high ratio, you could hear and feel that it was a really intense cut down every time a big strum happened. So it would cut that initial hit way down and bring it down to a lower volume. And then it would open up and ring back out again as it sustained between each strum. Versus when we did a low ratio, like a 2 to 1, it was barely cutting anything out. And that's just because it's not doing as much. It's told, hey, don't cut this signal nearly as much like the 10 to 1. And then when we engaged the soft knee, you probably heard that it kind of was compressing a little bit on the lower end of volume notes, such as like the sustained parts and in between moments of strumming, but it wasn't hitting the initial attack or transients nearly as hard as it was with it off. And that was just because it was already compressed before the next strum. So we were able to kind of make it a more cohesive sound. It didn't have as much of a aggressiveness to it like it did before, where there was that pumping effect because of the crazy high ratio. Now let's quickly take a listen again here. We're going to go do a 4 to 1 ratio. We'll adjust the threshold so that way we're only cutting about 10 dB, because I want you to hear this. I know this isn't what I would actually set it to, but I want you to be able to hear what's happening when we change the attack and release times in this instance. All right, so let's grab the attack here and crank it all the way up. And as you can hear, probably those initial hits are getting really smashed all of a sudden, versus if we slow it down. So as you can hear, when we had the fast attack, it was really grabbing every single one of those strums in the initial hit of it, the initial transient. But as soon as we slowed it down, it was waiting almost 300 milliseconds because we had it set so slow. It was waiting after those initial transients to then compress. And so it let the initial hit through, and then it would start compressing all what was left after that moment. Now let's take a listen to the release time with the attack set at a more average setting. So let's crank the release up to a super fast. And then slow it down. Go back up again. Slow it down. All right, let's talk about what we just heard. We just heard a fast release, which let us hear the initial hit come through, and then it would immediately let it go as soon as it went below the threshold. So the volume difference was quite dramatic from the initial hit to when it was over. Versus the slow release, it almost felt like everything was at this same volume the whole time. And that's because the compressor never really let go. It was set to 2 seconds. So the compressor never had any time to reset and grab it again. It never really let go of the signal ever from what it was. So what are we doing exactly when we're choosing these attack and release times? Well, we're choosing how we want the transient of the signal, the initial impact or first thing we hear of it, how we want to hear that. Do we want it to be aggressive and upfront, or do we want it to be more subdued and a little bit more pulled back? And then do we want it to be in line with the sustained element of it, like the moment after that initial hit? Do we want those to be the same volume? Do we want them to be different? We're choosing how that is happening. Another way to think about this, though, is that we're also using this to control the overall volume of things without having to write our finger on the fader. So let's listen to a vocal here and see how we can use it to control the big moments that a vocalist might have in their performance.
Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love, in death and life, your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love.
All right, so let's talk about what we just heard. First off, when we hear this without the compression, the difference between the first line of your love versus never fails, never gives up, the difference in volume between those two was quite immense. It was almost about 10 dB, and that's just because the first line he sings, the first few words, are very intense. It's a higher register, he's got to push more, and he's trying to really make an impact with what he's saying with those words. But then when he gets to the second part where he says, never gives up and never runs out on me, like that whole part is a lot quieter. So what did we able to do when we turned the compressor on is that we were able to bring the volume difference between the first few words and everything else behind it, which are much different, almost 10 dB. We were able to bring them in line with each other so that way they were the same volume. So that way it didn't feel like they were like jumping out at you up front to the point where you were like, oh my gosh, and then everything else was lost because it was so quiet. If in a live context where the rest of the band's playing, that'd be really hard to hear. You'd hear probably the first initial word or two, and then everything else would get tucked underneath because it's such a big difference. We're trying to bring it so that way it's the same volume the whole time. But what we're able to do at the same time is still have the authority and feel the impact and difference between how he says the first word, which we want, and then the rest of the stuff is still in line with itself and how it was originally, being that it was not as authoritative and not as like in your face. What we're trying to do is just simply control the volume or perceived volume difference and bring it in line. And that gives us the ability to hear everything with a lot more clarity because we're actually not fighting the fact that the volume difference is so immense. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually set up a compressor when we get to the mixing section, but I hope this was helpful in helping you get a better understanding of the controls of compression and how to use them best. Now, in this next video, we're going to talk about probably the most controversial thing of all time, but not a lot of people talk about it, and that's going to be what a fader really is.